Hello all, we'll kick it off. So thank you again for joining us today for today's webinar, Creating Inclusive Leaders Through Mentoring. My name is Heidi Holmes. I'm the co-founder and COO of Mentorloop. We're about making life-changing connections, and we're on a mission to make more of those connections accessible to more people. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to do an acknowledgement of country and begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So before we get stuck into it, it's important that we also introduce ourselves and acknowledge the wonderful panelists I've got joining me here today. So we've got Winitha, Bonney, who is a Future of Leadership and Inclusion expert, and also Shivani, Tholasi from the Institute of Managers and Leaders, who'll be talking about their actual mentor program. And it's one of our customers who's also won our most impactful mentor program award in 2022. So I'll hand it over. Maybe if we can start with a short introduction from yourself, Winitha.
Hi, thanks so much for that, Heidi. I am a Future of Leadership and Inclusion expert. What that means is I work with leaders and support them to bridge that gap between diversity, equity, and inclusion, and translating that in a way that is meaningful to their business, and meaningful to their consumers, and meaningful to the wider community as well. You can kind of look at me like a translator. The work can be very complex. So I love working with really fantastic brands and leaders to help them go on that journey. And I like to, yeah.
I love that interpretation of translator. That's a nice way to put it. I think that's what we'll need today. So thank you. So Shivani.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Heidi. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. As Heidi mentioned earlier, I'm Shivani Tholasi. I'm the Membership and Higher Education Coordinator at the Institute of Managers and Leaders, Australia and New Zealand. My role at IML is multidimensional. It involves coordinating and putting together a lot of engaging member events that keeps the excitement flowing and value addition happening. But that's not all. I also manage AM AEST's award-winning mentoring program. Today, I'm absolutely stoked about our discussion on creating inclusive leadership through mentoring. Today, I'm absolutely stoked about our discussion on creating inclusive leadership through mentoring. Today, I'm absolutely stoked about our discussion on creating inclusive leadership through mentoring. Today, I'm absolutely stoked about our discussion on creating inclusive leadership through mentoring.
So I know we all probably have our own opinions around what we think inclusion is and also inclusive leadership, but I think it's important for today's discussion that we get a bit of a baseline and a consistent definition that we can reference throughout the discussion. Now, I'm definitely not the expert on this subject. That's why we have Winitha and also Shivani along today. So Winitha, I'd love to just start with you and hear how you define, I guess, inclusion firstly, and then we'll move on to inclusive leadership in your field of expertise and also your day-to-day work.
Yeah, so I think there's two components to inclusion. First of all, with inclusion, ultimately it's about people feeling like they really matter. Like their work matters, their input matters, their ideas matters, their concerns, their feedback matters, that they essentially matter. And when it comes to looking at who feels like they matter, it's about acknowledging that there are groups and communities of people right now whose voices are not heard, whose work is not valued, and perhaps they may not be working in our organization, in our teams as well. So with inclusion, it's about acknowledging the historical trend that unfortunately we have in the world right now around exclusion, discrimination. And inclusion is about breaking down those barriers and creating a safe space, a respected space where everyone feels like they truly matter. So inclusive leadership is the skill to look at where diversity is lacking. And diversity, when I talk about diversity, I mean diversity with air quotation marks. No one is diverse. We have individuals and people with a whole range of lived experiences. And unfortunately, there are groups and identities of which experience exclusion. So inclusive leadership is the ability to have awareness and understanding of that. And through that awareness and understanding, the ability to create diversity in your team, so ensuring there's representation. And then the third layer of that is how do we create a culture where if you've got a group of people with completely different worldviews of the world based on their identity and their own experience of living in the world, how do you create a harmonious working relationship amongst all your team members where we respect each other's view of the world, we respect our beliefs, our value systems, our ideas, our concerns, our feedback, so that we can ultimately create a high-performing team.
Love that. Yeah. And look, lots of layers here that we need to consider. So it's hard to like have one, I guess, definition. And that's why I wanted to start with that. But also, Shivani, interested to hear if you've got anything to add alongside what Winitha's just mentioned there.
Absolutely. I totally agree with what Winitha mentioned. Maybe I would just get in a simple example here in terms of explaining inclusive leadership better. Let's take maybe Australians' favorite sport, soccer. So a soccer team doesn't only have attacking roles, but also has defending roles, midfield roles, and goalkeeper. And along with this, all the players hail from different parts of Australia. Isn't that full of diversity? A stable and solid utilization of all these components, namely forwards, defenders, midfielders, and goalkeepers, make the team win the game. So if the captain of the soccer team criticizes the forward player that he or she doesn't know how to defend the ball, or ignores the role of defenders by accusing them they do not know how to attack the ball, this will obviously hand the team to distress cause. So basically combining the skills, abilities, diversities, and the powers of all these puzzled set of players into a defined purpose, a captain transforms this unclear diversity into a formidable team. So this is inclusive leadership, and this will win the game for the team.
Thanks. I love, a sporting analogy is always welcomed in Australia, and I think with the success of the recent World Cup, that's a nice context-setting piece. So thank you. So why is inclusive leadership important? Look, we know the stats are there to back up diversity. The general consensus among most of us is that in many aspects, diversity, inclusion is going to be beneficial to an organization's bottom line. Diversity equals better business. But I think there's an important catch here that we've found is largely missed in conversation about diversity and inclusion. And so I'd love to just spend a little bit more time here to deep dive here with you, Winitha, on the business case piece specifically. The why around that, when we have diverse teams, inclusive leadership is obviously vital. And I want to sort of talk about why plain old box ticking diversity, the quotations diversity, isn't enough, and why leaders do actually need this additional dimension to their skill set to manage and lead teams and people effectively.
Yeah, great question. And this is why I talk also, like, the work links into the future of business. It's about leading the future today. And for me, that's where there's a real gap when it comes to leadership skills and also people skills as well. So there's an opportunity here for us to better lead the future by looking at what those skill gaps are. And one of those pivotal skills gaps is inclusive leadership. So like you said, if we simply look at diversity or inclusion as a tick boxing exercise, essentially what we're going to create is additional challenges for our teams and for our business as well. And that then leads on to the reputation of the brand as well. So it's kind of like having a house and knowing that your roof is leaking. So a lot of the times organizations focus on diversity, focusing really on recruitment. And people come into your organization, they're working in the organization, then they realize that there's a leak in your roof. So the first thing that we need to be doing is fixing that leak. And that leak is around your skills to create safety and respect and a sense of belonging for people that have experienced marginalization and discrimination for most of their life. So having the skill to do that is actually the thing that needs to come first, because what ends up happening is we have what I call a leaky recruitment pipeline. So people come into the organization, they're like, great, I've got this job. Oh, hang on. This is not set up for me to, survive, let alone thrive.
I was sold something different.
Yes. Sold a false, there's a leak in the roof, people have wanted me to work in the business but they don't understand me, and they don't understand my internal, external barriers. They don't understand why it's difficult for me to, once I'm in the business, why I'm struggling to gain a leadership position myself, because they don't understand what those systemic barriers are. So inclusive leadership really is the skill to create safety, respect, and belonging.
I guess pausing on this, coming back to the business case again, when we have inclusive leadership, it is going to result in better business outcomes. So more effective teams, greater collaboration. I guess you could also talk to here potential for greater creativity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much research out there that talks about the benefits of inclusion. I think the really key thing, my invitation to leaders and to, everyone's a leader. It's not, just because of the title of your job.
Yeah.
And it's about, we all understand the why. The question is the what and the how. So where I find people get stuck is what do we do and how do we develop that skill and that capability? And the why, as you shared before, it's really around, it helps the bottom line because you've got that cognitive diversity that's based on that person's view of the world, how they process information because of their lived experience.
That brings me to this stat, which I found really interesting, because I think if you actually ask most leaders out there, if they were inclusive, the majority are going to say, yes, I'm an inclusive leader. But when we look at this stat here, it tells us differently. And that's why I guess we need to put some parameters around what actually is and justifies an inclusive leader. And that's exactly what Korn Ferry have done here. And we'll share this deck afterwards so you can access the research. But they've gone away and analysed over 3 million leadership assessments, and from that identified 5 key traits, 5 key disciplines that define an inclusive leader. So I think what we could potentially all agree on in this call is that probably the majority of your leaders are failing at this. So I'm keen to hear from I guess both of you, why do you think people think they're doing a better job at this than they actually are?
Yeah, no one wants to think they're a bad person. One of the things, really, that's what it's about, right? Like, there's so 100%. There's so much out there about shame culture, cancel culture. No one wants to be canceled. Like the number one thing that I hear from whether I'm doing training or, working with a leadership team is, can you give me a prescription of what to say and what to do? Because I don't want to say and do the wrong thing. That's great. What sits underneath that? This fear of being shamed or canceled. What sits underneath that? This fear of being labeled or looked at or judged as a bad person, right? And so I think a lot of us, even in my own journey, when I've done executive roles, we're so focused on getting the job done and focused on doing the job done that even when someone raises something to us and gives us constructive feedback, we immediately can go back into shame, right? And that's when all the justification happens. So, this could become a very, deep conversation very quickly. And I really believe that we operate from such a lack of self-awareness that if we don't have the self-awareness around ourselves and our own experience in the world, how can we relate and connect to the awareness of someone else's lived experience? If we are not aware of our own pain and suffering, then how can we connect to the pain and suffering of other people as well? So there's a denial that goes in, because when we acknowledge the pain and suffering of other people, we are forced to acknowledge the pain and suffering of ourselves as well. And so there's a denial, and there's also BAU stuff, right? Business as usual. KPIs to be matched, things that need to be done, projects that need to be completed. And so there are many other things that get in the way with this sort of lack of self-awareness of areas that we can do better at as a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll hopefully kind of, I guess, address that piece around self-awareness and emotional intelligence in this next phase when we get to, I guess, how we tie mentoring into this as well. But Shivani, in your work at IML as well, you know, is this something that's coming up? Like, are people talking about inclusive leadership and seeing it as, I guess, a soft skill?
Thanks, Heidi. And I think to add on to what Winitha mentioned, yes, the leaders find working with homogeneous groups their comfort zone, and having to effectively manage diversity is a difficult task and an added work for them. I think it's simply way too much work. And then secondly, the leaders consider their position an authority and less a facilitator of accountability. So I think they sometimes feel being an inclusive leader makes them look soft, which drives them away from being an inclusive leader. And I guess the traditional mindset of the leader, where he or she presumes an individual's caliber and capacity based on his or her looks, background, the institute they've graduated from, their gender, and their experience, all these kind of come into consideration when you are wanting to be an inclusive leader. And I guess to add on to that, last but not least, the leaders know inclusive leadership can be the best weapon in their armory, but I guess sometimes they lack the tools to build upon it. And this is kind of the most suitable point that makes inclusive leadership look difficult. And it is a big yes. Many of them who reach out to us, who come to us, they want to upskill themselves in the simply yet vast arena of leadership through inclusiveness. So managers and leaders who come to us can, I guess, be categorized into two sets. Some of them who approach us come with clarity, seeking that they want to learn many facets of inclusive leadership. But some of us are a bit unclear of what they want to upskill on, and they want to upskill on leadership as a whole. So I think, so I would say, yes, it's a big yes. People do come to us in terms of upskilling for this particular skill, I can say.
I guess my takeaway here from listening to you both, the good news is this is not an inherent trait. You're not born an inclusive leader. So there's all hope for us. Anyone can become an inclusive leader with the right support, training, and I guess connections and support as well. So in saying that out loud, I guess I'm keen to take the discussion from the why and the what to the how. And I guess this is where we come back to today's subject of the webinar, creating inclusive leaders through mentoring. Obviously there are a number of different strategies at play, and there's no one silver bullet we can talk to. It is a strategy that is multifaceted, but I do believe that mentoring does have an important role to play here. You can have training courses for leaders, as Shivani sort of mentioned there, but I think what mentoring actually offers is an opportunity for some of the theory we've been discussing here to actually play out for leaders and employees through making diverse, meaningful connections. And so that piece around self-awareness that you spoke to as well, Winitha, this is a place where through mentoring, I guess we can lower some of those hierarchical barriers. We can open ourselves up and we can make ourselves more vulnerable. And we always say at Mentorloop, the best mentoring connections are reciprocal in nature. So I don't think this has to be a talk about hierarchical mentorship or even reverse mentoring. We don't need to put that sort of label on it, but I think it becomes about creating a space where people are able to share lived experiences, and where mentors, who in this scenario might be the leaders, can practice sort of active listening, show restraint in maybe giving advice. And this gets a bit closer to that human connection and maybe activating, that EQ. So I guess I'm keen to, talk more practically here. So Shivani, I know, at the IML mentor program isn't specifically about creating, inclusive leaders. But I'd love to just hear a little bit more about, you in terms of the program, and I guess that layer of how inclusion does come into the connections that you see through your program.
Let me break it down into a simple, I guess, smaller bits. Even though IML ANZ's mentoring program isn't specifically branded as an inclusive leadership one, that's mainly because we focus on the entirety of the concept of leadership and implementation of the same. We teach and facilitate many tools and practices that equip a manager or a leader with highly potent skills that help him or her in smooth implementation and management of inclusive leadership framework back at his or her workplace. As they say, knowing what to do is important, but knowing what not to do is super important. So I think that's why we've made it more comprehensive, and we've not specifically named it an inclusive leadership program. So we've just given it a general name, IML ANZ's mentoring program. Now to address your second part of the question, Heidi, around the history or the purpose or growth of this program. Well, we started this mentoring initiative back in 2016 after a lot of research and development and homework, of course. I guess the trigger point that made us introduce this program was simple. So we knew managers and leaders were doing their best, but based on our research results, we concluded it wasn't enough. Most of them were missing certain skill sets like inclusive leadership, among others, which were low risk, but of course, high reward skills. This drove us on working up a program that has an amalgamation of the modern leadership shortcomings with a solid solution and, I guess, remedies. So our main purpose statement of this particular program was professional and leadership development, opportunity for networking, inclusion and diversity, and knowledge transfer. And as you mentioned, Heidi, mentoring is not a single dimensional, program. It's a dual dimensional one. So it's a two-way mentorship wherein an individual can assume the role of being both a mentor and a mentee at the same time. I think he or she will be a mentee to fill his or her skill gaps and overcome his or her shortcomings, and a mentor in enhancing those skills. And I guess sharing that to a person who might be helpful to drive towards career development and career progression. Participants in our mentoring program have experienced significant professional growth. Mentees have received guidance in advance from experienced mentors, helping them develop essential skills, navigate challenges, and also achieve their career goals. This has resulted, of course, in improved job performance, increased confidence, and enhanced leadership abilities. As Heidi mentioned earlier, everyone is not a born leader. Even if he or she is one, being an inclusive leader is a different ballgame altogether. So I think this deficiency can be easily mitigated by one of the aspects, which is mentoring, which is highly cost effective, but also highly rewarding.
This is getting into some more of the hard data from your program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I think when you look at this slide, you can see the diversity of participants who are involved in the program. So I guess there's gender ratio, there's mentees and mentors who experience which range from 1 to 10 years or even beyond. And the participants hail from quite diverse industries as well. So I think the participants are registering, seeing the past results and transformations, and they're coming in huge numbers, and it's working for them. And because of the diversity quotient, it's also helping them become more inclusive and also develop on their skill of being an inclusive leader.
Great. I just want to call out, I love this either split. So people having the option to be both a mentee and a mentor. And I think, Winitha, you mentioned it at the start of today's session as well. You know, a leader doesn't necessarily mean, you know, the senior execs within the organization. You know, I think we all have a role to play as a leader. And even if you're, you know, early on in your career, there's still someone behind you that I think within mentoring, this is where very early on, mentoring can play a huge role in developing our future leaders, because you're not always given the chance to manage people. But through a mentoring relationship, you can start to develop those skills. Winitha, anything you wanted to add here as well?
Yeah, to confirm what you said, really, which is everyone has something to contribute and to give to another person. And when we all do that actively, in an organization through, for example, a mentor program, the business and the team culture is much stronger for it as well. There's much deeper connections and also space to support people. So for me, mentoring programs aren't just about lifting, diversity at those senior levels. It's about connection and creating structured space for our team members to connect and support one another, and not just focus on completing tasks and getting jobs done, which is also really important too.
I think on the slide, we can see some of the feedbacks, the comments that we've received from some of the existing participants in the program. So by looking at that, I can say it is proof that mentoring has generated numerous success stories. I think participants have achieved career milestones, overcome challenges, and this program has helped them realize their potential to the fullest as well. The success stories inspire others within the organization and the member community to take part in mentoring and invest in their professional and personal growth as well. I think I also want to mention and add to this that the pool of mentors and mentees in our existing mentoring program range from bottom of the ladder employees to the top of the ladder CEOs and CFOs. So that shows the level of diversity that a mentoring program can hold, because the people or the participants who are in the program are from different industries, different roles, different, levels in their experience as well. It's a really mix of talents across experience and discipline. This is what makes the difference and plays a role of creating inclusive leadership through mentoring. I think here I would like to bring in one of the challenges that we might have faced earlier, or maybe when we run a mentoring program, ease and cost of running it can be demanding and challenging. Indeed, it was when we started out this program at IML back in 2016. Some of our common challenges were initially dealing with paper applications, which was incredibly time consuming, especially when it came to sorting and creating mentoring connections. And it was also challenging to effectively track activities and send follow-up emails to participants. Logging data and reporting the program's success proved to be a difficult task as well. I can say we were excelling in marking, great potential and making the good leader into the best. But these above issues or challenges were slowing us down a bit. And then we came across and partnered with Mentorloop, which we're really grateful about, because this became our one-stop solution for, all of our difficulties of managing this.
Right. Shivani, I didn't know you were going to do the hard sell at the end, but thank you.
I did have to thank you for.
I think, no, but I think what you pulled out here is, we had a look at the hard data, but what we see here is what we love at Mentorloop, and this is the real impact. And I think it's through qualitative feedback that you actually can articulate where the impact is happening in your organization. I think this really brings it to life. For when you're reporting on the success of an initiative such as this to senior stakeholders as well. I want to move to questions, and I've seen a few have come through in the chat, so I'll read those out. So the first one I've got here: in a business setting, how can organizations encourage leaders to make time for cultivating that self-awareness that Winitha spoke about? Most people, especially senior leaders, might think it's frivolous or something to be done in your own time. And as Shivani said as well, it can be seen as something as a bit soft.
I'll jump right in.
Go for it.
Whoever asked the question, thank you for asking that in service, everyone. It's a really important question. So one of the ways that we would do that is through a structured program, such as a mentoring program. And the other things that we might do is, run a leadership program or a coaching program. So leadership really is about self-awareness. If you don't have self-awareness, that's how we end up with toxic cultures. That's how we end up with bullying, discrimination, because hurt people ultimately hurt people. There's a whole psychology behind that. So the way that we engage leaders, or the way that I myself engage leaders to doing this work, to then really include more, lead more inclusively and create more healthy, better performing cultures, is to frame it around leadership. So we start off with the business program, with the business problems, and then we essentially take them on a journey of putting all the pieces together to see how it actually starts with self-awareness. So that's what people need. They need to kind of start with what's top of mind for them, what's on the top of their shopping list. It's really about completing tasks, hitting KPIs, hitting targets, getting the job done, exceeding results and expectations. And then what we do is then take them on a journey where we actually show them, and where they have that process of self-discovery to understand that this is where it starts with self. And then they can trace it all the way back to those achieving those outcomes. So we need to start off with where people are at and meet them where they're at, take them on a journey. And the way that we create time is putting some structure around it through a program such as this.
Yeah, I think what we see at Mentorloop too, and some of the feedback that comes through, where it's not even talking about, I guess, inclusive leadership specifically at the program level, but mentors often say they always feel like they've learned more through the experience than their mentees. Like their mentees have given them so much. And I think, yeah, it's not like we're tricking people into becoming, but it's a way that it, as we say, it does break down those barriers. It's non-confrontational, and it leads to that self-discovery of your own self-awareness, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this is leadership, right?
Yeah.
And the best way to learn, the best way to develop as a leader is through a mentoring relationship, both being a mentor and a mentee. Like that's one of the best ways to phenomenally, in a very short amount of time, is much more effective than completing an MBA, right? Or doing some other kind of really structured leadership program where you're really going into like the old school Western patriarchal paradigms of what leadership looks like.
Well, on that you've just touched there, because I'm going to bring in another question here. We've got, how do we encourage leaders to join programs like this, despite the fear that's been mentioned about saying the wrong thing, especially when they don't have a lot of experience with diverse groups, e.g. older leaders in very old school industries? Let's call it out.
Yeah. You've got to meet them where they're at. You've got to create trust with them. Once you've created a sense of, it's kind of like you're role modeling the intention of being of the outcomes, right? So in order to create that desired outcome for that individual and their ability to create safety, respect, and belonging, you've got to actually create that for them first.
Yeah.
So once you have established a relationship and gain their trust, then it's about not throwing them into the deep end. It's about going through that journey in incremental steps and knowing how to facilitate that conversation really well. Mentoring is a structure, and sometimes we need to actually ask coaching conversations. So rather than us telling people, actually ask them a question where they can come to that conclusion, that result themselves. And when people don't have a lot of experience with, diverse or marginalized groups, that's why them participating in a program is really important. Going back to the first question, people are not going to make the time because it's not high up on their priority list. Hitting targets, KPIs, that's their priority right now. So that's why putting structure, and then once we have structure and we have a structured approach to having a relationship with that person, then being part of that program, them understanding this is ultimately about their leadership skills, we can create a safe space for them to bring those sticky questions, those uncomfortable questions, those uncomfortable beliefs. And then we, as the mentor or mentee, need to create a space where there's no judgment, because that's what they need. They need to unpack that. They need to ask those questions.
So I've got another question here that I'm going to sort of paraphrase, maybe back to you, Shivani. What would you say, and you've kind of touched on, I guess, but just calling out, what would you say the main 3 things you want to get right in setting up a program, a mentoring program specifically?
Yeah, of course. I think having a great structure, as Winitha mentioned earlier, is very important. And I guess having set mentoring guidelines as well. So when you are forming a loop or a connection between a mentor and a mentee, guiding them throughout the program and being available and, giving them a nudge in terms of like setting up their first catch up or sending through some checklists on what they have to or how they have to run the program, because not all of them would have experience in being a part of the mentoring program, and for some of them it might be new. So I think just basically regular check-ins and also some amount of training, so that would kind of help them.
Awesome. And I'm going to give you this spicy one. What have you seen go wrong, I guess, Winitha, in the mentoring programs that you've come across that have done more harm than good?
Yeah, it's exactly that, right? You need to mentor the mentors. Because when people don't understand what people in the world go through and what they go through in the workplace and what they've repeatedly gone through in the workplace, they say things that actually cause hurt and harm to the other individual and may actually shut down the individual as well. And it goes both ways as well. Sometimes it's a mentee. The thing that I've seen the most in the work that I've done, because my work is primarily around creating leadership programs or mentoring programs where we're seeking to lift diversity at those senior executive levels. What we actually need to do first is, mentor the mentors first. So mentor them in the lived experience of women and what women experience in the workplace, and mentor them in that journey first so that they have a better understanding, and then they then dive into the actual program.
Yeah, nice. I like that. And look, I'm conscious of time, and also I think that's a nice place to leave today's session. But I would just firstly, before we call it a day, like to thank my panelists here for taking time out of their busy days to share their insights and expertise. So thank you, Winitha. Thank you, Shivani, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you to all of our participants for dialing in today. I hope you found it to be a productive and useful and insightful session. We do appreciate you taking time out of your day as well, and we'll be in touch with some follow-up resources. But otherwise, thank you. Enjoy your days. Catch you soon. Cheers.